welcome to this edition of Vision Alignment Show. It's Brian Wagner, and we have a very special guest today, someone that you may not have expected to be on this call. His name, well, I'm gonna wait a minute before I tell you his name. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about him. So, can you believe it? We have Will Rogers on today. I thought he died in 1935, but I guess not, because he's here. Will never met a man he didn't like, and everyone likes Will Rogers. He is known as a movie star, a writer, a radio commentator, and a professional speaker. He pokes fun at Congress and jokes with presidents. In the early part of the 1900s, Will Rogers was our best known American. Who would have known that? He was a legend, and his legacy endures. His wit and wisdom are still fresh. We're going to experience Will Rogers as he was in the 1920s and 1930s. But be alert. He will also talk about our world today in 2020. Let's welcome Will Rogers. Good morning, Will.
Howdy, everybody.
How are you?
I'm doing all right. Speaking of 2020, I think all of us would just rather forget about 2020 and move on to.
I'm sure you're right. So, Will, I wanted to have you on today so we could talk a little bit more about leadership. I know that leadership is an area where you excel and have had numerous conversations with some of your friends, but I'm wondering if you would just give us a little bit of an idea of what you were going to talk about today.
I don't claim to be much of a leader myself. My wife Betty did most of the leading once we got married, but I was fortunate to have a lot of friends who everybody will recognize as being top leaders. People like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and John D. Rockefeller, Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, Amelia Earhart. So these are five, I think that's five, that we'll talk about today. I had others too, including Harvey Firestone from up here at Akron, but we'll talk about those. I'll share a little information on my interactions with them, and also specifically trying to give you some of the quotes, important tips on leadership that they used, that they live by, and that we can all benefit from today.
Well, it sounds like a great conversation that we're going to have, because after you talk about the leadership skills that are leadership traits and qualities that we all aspire to, we're going to have a brief interview with about 9 or 10 questions that we're going to go through. So, having said that, the floor is yours, Will.
Well, let me start with a couple of my own quotes, and I've found this one and highlighted it just for your benefit here, because I know we talk about vision. The quote is, "You can't broaden a man's vision if he wasn't born with one."
Hey, now that I can relate to. It's all about vision.
It's all about vision, you bet. And then another one is pretty often quoted, if you want to be successful, you've got to know what you're doing, love what you're doing, and believe in what you're doing.
Wow. Yeah, those are great words to live by.
And just another one on satisfaction. In my mind, when you're satisfied, you're successful. That's all there is to success, is just satisfaction. Now here's what we just finished the Democratic convention, and we got the Republicans we'll have to endure next week. I said, what this country needs is more working men and fewer politicians. Of course, today I should say more working men and women and fewer politicians. Then here's another favorite. America is a land of opportunity, and don't ever forget it. So now I'd suggest that we go on to some of my friends, if you want to, Brian.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. You got a lot of good quotes. Where do you come up with all these quotes, Will?
Well, these were friends of mine, so it's
Okay.
it's easy to get.
Well, I'll let you back to it then.
Henry Ford was a good friend of mine. Every time I got up to Detroit, going across the country, one way or the other, I'd try to stop in and spend a day with him. He had a great sense of humor. We got along so well. We're talk about Thomas Edison after a while. Did you know that Henry Ford worked for almost 10 years as an engineer for Edison?
What?
Yes, he worked for Edison, and I joked about Henry Ford. I said, well, while he was working for Edison, he used all of Edison's parts and took his time to build his first car. So that's how he managed to do that. But here, coming back to Henry Ford, his success in the car business was this very number one point. Back at that time, around 1900, people who were building cars built them one at a time, often in the garage. They just cut the parts out and drill them to make them fit. Well, when Ford got into it, and here's the key, he invented the assembly line. So every bumper was the same, every engine was the same, everything fit, no matter you start out with the basic frame and put four wheels on it. And as it rolled down the assembly line, a worker would put on a part, and that was his job for that day. And that's how he got going on it. He built the first Model T Ford in 1908, and it cost $500. I think one time I think he even dropped the price to $400 or $450, which was ridiculously below anybody else. At one time, half of the vehicles on the road were Fords. Really amazing. Here's something many people know. That Ford raised the wages of his workers to $5 an hour. Excuse me, $5 a day. $5 a day. And that was double what just about everybody else was paying back at that time. Now,
really,
you may have heard it quoted, well, that was so the workers made enough money they could actually afford to buy a Ford. But that was true, but that wasn't the reason he raised it. Everybody, think about it, back in that time, everybody was making about the same money. Let's just say $2.50. And it was boring to work on that assembly line. So he had tremendous turnover. He might hire a guy and after a month he'd leave and go work somewhere else. When he doubled their salary, their wages, he kept the good employees. They weren't going to go anywhere else. They wanted to work for Ford and earn that $5. And I think here's one of his quotes. We try to pay a man what he's worth, and we're not inclined to keep a man who is not worth more than the minimum wage. Think about that today. Suppose, and I'm just making up numbers here, suppose Wendy's paid their high school kids $10 an hour to work at Wendy's, and McDonald's said, well, we're going to pay you $20 an hour. Okay, that would have two effects. Number one, Wendy's would have a hard time finding any good employees, and McDonald's would have plenty of good employees, and they'd want to stay. And here's the second thing, though. Think about it. If McDonald's had some average or below average poor employees that they put up with because they were only paying them $10 an hour previously, but now they can hire better employees at $20. So those that weren't doing the job right, they're out of luck.
Yeah, I don't understand how they could compete.
They couldn't, but see, going back to Ford and the assembly line, because he was assembling the cars using mechanization. And now we got robots on the assembly line. But
Yeah.
back then it was mechanized with the assembly line. And so he could afford to pay more because he didn't need as many workers to do the job.
And this was back in 1908?
Yeah, back in that time, 1903 to 1908 is when he got successfully started with the Ford Motor Company. He had a couple of failures before then, but
we all do.
We all do. And here's an interesting quote. Back when he started building cars, he said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. People don't know.
Yeah. Bringing that up a little bit more recent, just imagine if Steve Jobs had asked people, they might have said, well, we need a faster typewriter. So we can use this concept all the time. We really need to be creative and think for ourselves and figure out creativity. With asking people doesn't always give you the right answer. Here's another one that's a good one to keep in mind. There's one rule for the manufacturer. You make the best quality goods possible at the lowest cost possible, and you pay the highest wages possible. That's quality of goods, low cost, high wages. And that is not easy to do. That really requires mechanization and automation in order to do that. You might be able to do 2 out of the 3, but getting all 3 of those is tough.
With technology being as it is these days, I would have to think that that's a little bit easier to achieve than it was back then. But I mean, back then, how did they achieve something like that?
Well, the assembly line was the key, and then once he got started on the assembly line, they kept making improvements. I forget the exact numbers, but maybe it took 5 hours to make a car 1 year, and they made certain improvements, and they got it down to, instead of 5 hours, it was a matter of maybe 45 minutes per Model T coming off the assembly line.
Wow, that's amazing.
So it's that kind of creativity is what we need to do.
Interesting. That's really interesting. 45 minutes. That's amazing.
Well, yep. So here's a couple more. Even a mistake might turn out to be the one thing necessary to a worthwhile achievement. Success is 99% failure.
Yeah.
There'll be a similar quote that I'll share from Thomas Edison in a little bit too.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure you got many of them.
So of course I'm a Ford fan. So
yeah.
I like driving Fords. And here's something that's frustrating. Probably all of us have a little bit of investment in the stock market, but I just checked on this. Tesla is the new name. Tesla has a market value that is 12 times the value of Ford. Just think about that. 12 times more valuable than Ford. And yet, in the last 12 months, Ford sold 10 times as many vehicles.
Wow.
Out of those F-150 Ford pickup trucks. So that, of course, the Tesla value is based on future expectations. That's what it has to be.
Yeah. Pickup trucks are hard to find these days.
Yeah. So it's just amazing how the stock market works on that.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just thought that was an interesting comment. You want to move on to Thomas Edison?
Sure.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned that Ford worked for him. Now they were good friends. Henry Ford admired, you probably use the word loved, Thomas Edison because he had done so much for him. Give you one example. Every summer, at least when they could, Henry would go pick up for a week or two. They'd go camping with Thomas Edison and Harvey Firestone. Now, Thomas Edison, we're here in Central Ohio. Thomas Edison was born in Milan, Ohio, north of. So they'd go camping, and I'm just intrigued by that idea. Imagine they'd travel through the hills of Pennsylvania and West Virginia and Ohio, and just imagine them sitting around the campfire. If you could listen in on their conversations as they'd be driving along. They probably had a few flat tires to fix too, even though it was Firestone.
Firestone and Edison went camping.
Yeah. Now I don't know if it was if they roughed it or what camping was back then, but the point was, imagine these three top industrial people just going out and enjoying each other, conversation. I'm sure they were learning from each other and picking up tips. But imagine if our leaders today, some of them, even politicians on opposite sides, if they got together in a friendly situation like that, if they had to build a campfire and they didn't have any matches, see how they would do. Well, to give you to move farther on, and for the 50th anniversary of Edison inventing the incandescent light, Ford put on a huge banquet in Dearborn. All the top people. President Hoover was there. I was invited at that banquet. I was out in the audience. I sat next to Orville Wright. So the date of the celebration is important. I want to make sure I get this right. It was October 21st, 1929. So everybody was in a great mood. That was the roaring 20s, and everything was going great. But 3 days later, the stock market crashed. That was the start of the Great Depression. And the Great Depression didn't end until World War II, or even after World War II. The stock market didn't get back to where it was until about, I think, 1947.
So September 1st of 1929 was when the stock market crashed?
October
29th.
About October 24th was when it started.
And
it took a few days for it to keep going down, but it lost more than 80% of its value in a few days.
Wow.
And it didn't recover. So that was the start of the Great Depression. It was just interesting that huge celebration. Everybody, all the top men, top women were there. Anyway, okay, go ahead.
No, you were saying, so what went along with the stock market crash? Or you were saying something
about that was the start of the Great Depression.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah. And Herbert Hoover had just been elected president and inaugurated in March of that same year. So he was only president for 6 or 7 months before that hit. So that just ruined his presidency. And that Great Depression, and that result, we'll talk about Franklin Roosevelt in a little bit, but that was the predecessor or the real cause of moving from a Republican Hoover over to the Democrat Rockefeller.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, here's a couple of things from Edison. Opportunity is missed by most people because it's dressed in overalls and it looks like work. Another one, genius is 1% inspiration and 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. And Edison, I know we hear about President Trump working really long hours, but Edison apparently worked about 20 hours a day.
Wow.
That probably means he needed that camping trip in the summer.
Yeah.
But he didn't get much sleep. He also said the three great essentials to achieve anything worthwhile are hard work, stick-to-itiveness, and common sense. I love that common sense. That's one of my favorites also.
Yeah.
And here's another one. Many people have heard this in one form or another. They said, I haven't failed. I just found 10,000 ways that don't work. It took him a long time to get an incandescent lamp that worked. And it's the basic. I've got three of them surrounding me right here. Of course, we've come up with newer lights, but the incandescent is still here. The only fault of the incandescent lamp is that it puts off light, but it also puts off a lot of heat.
Yeah,
Wasted energy.
that's true.
Here's another, and I'll close with this one on Edison. Our greatest weakness lies in giving up. The most certain way to succeed is always to try just one more time.
Yeah, that's a great one.
Yeah.
That's a great one. Good.
All right. Want to move on to a different business? We talk about electricity and cars. How about oil?
Sounds good to me. Let's go.
John D. Rockefeller. He made the Rockefeller fortune in oil. Perhaps not in a way that you would imagine. You might think, well, he found a lot of oil and drilled it. But here's when he got started. Oil was shipped in barrels, 42 gallons of oil in a barrel, wooden barrels. And the way it would be shipped is a man would roll a barrel up on a railroad flat car, or maybe on a truck or a river barge. Typically, the rail cars and the river barge held 20 of these barrels, and that's the way they were shipped. and Rockefeller said, "There's got to be a better way of doing this." So he invented the railroad tank car. We see them all the time now, but back then they didn't think about it. So again, that was automation. Think about it that way. You just pump the oil into a huge tank car and take it to the refinery or to its destination.
So Rockefeller invented that, huh?
Rockefeller invented that. Now he started, those of us here in Ohio like this, he started Standard Oil Company in Cleveland. And many people know this. It was a monopoly. Man, he had, from drilling oil, he was both horizontally integrated and vertically integrated. He had the gas stations as well as the oil wells and everything in between. So he was a monopoly, Standard Oil Company, about 90%, 80 to 90% of the business. And they put in the Sherman Antitrust Act in Congress, and the government took apart the Standard Oil Company and made him separated, I think, altogether into about 37 or 35 different companies. But the main ones that many of you will recognize these names. The Standard Oil Company separated mainly into 7 different ones geographically, mostly by states. For example, here in Ohio, Standard Oil of Ohio was Sohio. Now it's part of BP. Standard Oil of New Jersey, and by the way, he moved the headquarters to New Jersey because of tax situations. But Standard Oil of New Jersey was Esso, which is now Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil, and now Exxon and Mobil are together. Standard Oil in California became Chevron. Standard Oil of Indiana, Amoco, American Oil Company, Amoco. So those are three examples. I meant there was another Ohio company, and it became Marathon. So think of all those. Now Shell is a different company; it's Dutch, but just think about with all those companies, you can drive across the country and never buy a gallon of gas from anybody except one that started out as Rockefeller Standard Oil Company.
Huh, that's fascinating.
Now he died. He lived to be 97 years old. He died in 1937, and I visited him a number of times down at his winter home in Florida on the Gulf Coast. So he was just a great guy to talk to. He became once he made a lot of money, he just became a philanthropist. So everybody knows about the Rockefeller Foundation. And many of you will recognize we had John D. Rockefeller II, and then the third, Nelson Rockefeller, I think was governor of New York. He ran for president. J. Rockefeller was John D. Rockefeller IV. He was governor and senator from West Virginia, still living, But as far as I know, yeah, as far as I know, he's the last of the Rockefellers involved in politics. So I don't hear of any more. Well, anyway, back to John D. Rockefeller. He said, if you want to succeed, you need to strike out on new paths rather than travel the worn paths of accepted success. See that? Instead of shipping in 42-gallon barrels, he said, let's build a tank, a railroad tank car. This is really important today. He said, I will pay more for the ability to deal with people than for any other ability under the sun. You need to hire people who know how to get along with people.
You need to hire people.
Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He probably felt, well, if they're good and they get along with people, I can teach them the skills that they need to know.
Yeah.
Well, and here's one that relates to that. He said, I would rather earn 1% off of 100 people than 100% from my own efforts.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
So having other people, hiring good people. Good. And here's another one. Good leadership consists of showing average people how to do the work of superior people. Yeah, that's training. That's training.
All good leadership quotes here.
Yep. All right. We've talked about a bunch of men. How about bringing in a woman?
All right. Sounds good.
Amelia Earhart was a good friend. She was our first famous female pilot, and I got to know her pretty well because I like flying. I never was a pilot, but I looked at flying as being the fastest way to get from point A to point B, from city to city. If I was giving a speech in Chicago and I wanted to I was scheduled to give a speech in Omaha the next night, well, you fly there. In fact, back then there were women pilots, and they put on a race, just an air race for the women, and I coined the term powder puff derby. I don't know whether that would be appropriate today, but calling it the powder puff derby seemed like a good idea at the time. Now, Amelia Earhart was a pace setter. We all know that. She took on the challenges of living in a man's world. She was, and she led by example. She said, never interrupt someone who was doing what you said couldn't be done. So if somebody's doing something impossible, you just stand back and watch them and maybe applaud. I think this was back in the early 1930s. She said, times are changing and women need the critical stimulus of competition outside the home. Of course, back then, most of the women were homemakers. Man, they were working, but they were inside the home. Said the woman who can create her own job is the woman who will win fame and fortune. She definitely got the fame. I don't know about the fortune. Now this one, think about this one today. Girls, especially those whose tastes aren't routine, meaning they like the activities of typical boys, but they often don't get a fair break. It's come down through the generations that women are bred to be timid. Now, I think, okay, that was back in the 1930s. I don't think women are timid anymore.
No,
man, they're getting out there. They're just as obnoxious as the men are. So those are some interesting things about Amelia Earhart.
All right. Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
More good leadership quotes.
What's that?
More good leadership quotes, and these Amelia Earhart are very interesting. And so far we've hit Rockefeller, we've hit Ford, we've hit Amelia Earhart. Who's next? Franklin
Roosevelt.
Okay, FDR.
And we became good friends. I think it was because he kind of liked the ideas that I was espousing. Well, let me jump almost. Well, no, I better not tell it that way. I was saying repeatedly that we need to provide a pension to old folks. They shouldn't have to die in poverty. You had poor farms that people were sent to if they couldn't afford to live at home anymore. So that was the predecessor of Social Security that FDR signed the Social Security Act August the 14th, 1935. But I was asked to introduce him. I already talked about Hoover and the start of the Great Depression. So we had been in the Great Depression for about 3 years before the 1932 election. And it became pretty clear that because the Republicans had been in charge through the 20s, and it became clear in 1932 that no matter who the Democrats nominated, he was going to get elected. So it was fun for a Democrat. I was invited to introduce Roosevelt in Los Angeles at a huge rally that he held, a political rally in the summer of 32. And I said, let me find this, that this introduction will not be flowery or ostentatious because I am wasting no energy on just a candidate now, or a prospect. Now, after you're elected, I'll do right by you. So then later that summer at the Democratic National Convention, like the one we just held, except that one, like all of them, they were in person, not virtual. And I was there covering it, writing newspaper articles, and I had done that since 1920. So 1920, 24, 1928, and now 1932. I was covering the convention. Well, by that time, I had somewhat of a reputation to be funny and be a good speaker. So sometime along the line, there was a lull in the activities, and somebody just convinced me to get up on stage and talk to the delegates while some of the big wigs were out in another room somewhere doing something important. So I got out, just started talking. Of course, I was throwing in a bunch of humor and probably just talking about the government and reporting the facts. but that went on. They kept me up there for about an hour. And finally, here was my advice to them. I said, stick with the man you come here to nominate as long as you can. But when he loses, get behind the candidate of the majority, which in this case was Roosevelt. I said, go home and support him. And then I closed with this. I said, if he lives till November, he's in. So I was thinking of that last night. Don't take this the wrong way, but I think there's a lot of Democrats today that are saying kind of the same thing about Joe Biden. If he lives till November, he's in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Roosevelt he had plenty of good quotes. Of course, he was president for more than 3 terms. He was elected 4 times. He didn't live long after the 1944 election, but
right.
He said, it's common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, you just admit it frankly and you try another one. But after all, try something, do something. And that was his main criticism of Hoover. Hoover was kind of reluctant to do anything. And I just think about what's been done by Congress since March. $7 trillion they've pulled out of clear air and spent it. So that's kind of what Roosevelt and the Democrats did after the 1932 election when he got in there. And they tried some things that didn't work. But like you said, just admit it if it fails and move on. We've heard a lot about failure, haven't we, from these other people we've talked about today. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, that's
learn from it. He said, I'm not the smartest fella in the world, but I can sure pick smart colleagues. So he tried to put together a cabinet and other leaders that did a good job. And I got to like this one because he said, when you get to the end of your rope, tie a knot and hang on.
Now, I do like that one. That is
any quote that has the word rope in it, I'm going to like, unless it's a noose at the end of the rope.
So. That would be Will Rogers, that's for sure. So who else are we talking about?
That's it. That's
Oh,
all I've got. Yeah, that's all
well,
I got.
I wanted to ask you a few questions as well. Will, do you mind?
Sure. Yeah, and then I'll after we get through some of those questions, if it's all right with you, I'll close with 4 or 5 minutes of a closing that I do on most of my presentations for
Okay.
businesses and ag groups across the country. So
Okay.
go right ahead, fire away.
Good. Sounds good. So tell me, what's the biggest factor in your success?
Oh, that had to be getting married. My wife Betty and we were both 29 when we got married. We'd known each other and been friends for about 8 years, but various things, I flying around the country and actually leaving, and I was gone for more than 2 years around the world, South Africa and Australia. Anyway, but she was the rock. She brought things down. I joked one time on Mother's Day. I said, she's the mother that raised 4 youngins to adulthood, 3 by birth and 1 by marriage. So give all the credit to my wife. Probably a lot of men do the same thing, Brian. Maybe you do too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's for sure. So tell me, what's a key practice that you'd have or a tactic that you keep coming back to?
Oh, I think use common horse sense, keep your sense of humor, be a little bit careful about what you say. And I hope I've done all right the last 30 minutes or so.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And in all my time, of course, I'm pretty well known for poking fun at presidents and Congress and governors, as you mentioned at the introduction. But I was very careful. I did not criticize somebody based on their appearance. I was only joking about their positions and things that they could change.
Okay. So tell me, what brings you clarity?
Oh, well, I already mentioned Betty. If something was unclear, well, she'd straighten me out pretty quick. So I think I'm not sure what else to include in that, but just being clear, having a clear view of where you want to go in the future, being open to the opportunities as they present themselves.
Yeah. So tell me, what's the next level of success look like for you?
Let me back up and start at the beginning, if that's all right. I won't take all the time, but
all right.
My dad owned a ranch out there in Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma, near Oolaga. He had a man who was a former slave family, Dan Walker, who taught a bunch of us kids how to rope, spin a lasso. I was 4 years old. I stuck with it and got to the point where some people called me world-class roper. Yeah. Now here's a point. If I had stopped at that, you would not have me on your show here today, because there's a lot of those folks. It's a great talent, but that's not what got me on your show today. So that roping got me on vaudeville shows. That was the stage shows back there, 1905 up to say 1915, and about that time, the Ziegfeld Follies was the premier. That was the Cadillac of all the vaudeville shows, and that propelled me. I was doing speaking at that time, telling jokes as well as spinning a rope. Then newspaper guys would come to the show, and sometimes the next morning, if they found something interesting or funny, they'd put it in the newspaper. So that got me a little more well known. And back in 1918, they were making the movies. You may remember Edison invented the movie business pretty much, and it was right there in New Jersey, right across from New York City. So a guy named Sam Goldfish wanted me to come over and be in one of the movies. Of course, at that time they were all silent, but I made the first silent movie right there in New Jersey. Then, okay, I got it. So how'd they get to Hollywood? Well, think about it. Oh, by the way, Sam Goldfish, you may not recognize that name, but he changed his name to Sam Goldwyn. So Metro Goldwyn Mayer, yeah, MGM. He started that. So somebody figured out, it'd be a lot more interesting to make movies in California than it is in New Jersey. Not to put down New Jersey, but a lot more opportunities in California. So I moved out there with the movies and ended up making about 50 silent movies. Then, to stay with the movies for a moment, the movie started talking in 1927, and I made 21 talkies. I was average in the silent movies, but I was a talker, still a talker, just like you, Brian.
Yeah.
So when the movie started talking, I became a star. Made a lot of money at it.
That reminds me. Go ahead.
Well, and eventually, in terms of the money making, I was replaced by somebody you might recognize, Shirley Temple.
Oh.
But backing up a little bit, because of what I was doing back there on the Ziegfeld Follies and getting quoted in the newspaper, I got invited to write a newspaper column, a weekly article. It'd be like the op-ed page in your Sunday paper. Started that in 1922 and kept doing that every week. And then in 1927, the publisher of the New York Times said, "Why don't you write a daily item?" And I called it the Daily Telegram because I would send it in by telegram. I'd have to write it and send it in by, I think 4 p.m. was the deadline Eastern time, and it would be syndicated in papers all across the country the next day. Six of those every week.
Wow.
So there, and then radio. I had a radio broadcast 15 minutes on Sunday nights. So there was a time when I was making 3 or 4 movies a year, and that really doesn't take a whole lot of time to do that. 3 or 4 movies a year, writing of 6 daily columns, 1 weekly article, and radio broadcasts, and still traveling around across the country and giving speeches. So I was busy. I was adventurous.
You had multiple streams of revenue.
Well, I guess you could say some of those made money. Yeah. Yeah, it was. Seriously.
Well, that reminds me of the book you have on the shelf. What is that?
Well, I got one right here too. It's called
I never met a
Rogers. I never met a farmer I didn't like. These are, when you say I wrote it, actually I compiled things that Will said and wrote about agriculture, ranching and farming, and political things relating to agriculture. So that was about 6 years ago. I still have a few boxes of them. So if anybody's interested in reading about Will Rogers' quotes on agriculture, I'll show you. I wrote this because it's large print. You can see here how it looks. Because the prime reader is going to be old farmers. So don't have to squint to read it. So that's the book. It was fun to do that. And I give a lot of talks to agriculture people. So many of those quotes are what I use in my speeches.
So you got a lot of stuff going on, Will. So tell me, what do you do to recharge?
Oh, I get on a horse and rope a couple of steers. That was out at the ranch at Pacific Palisades. And that's near Santa Monica, north side of Los Angeles. I'd always keep, maybe 15 or 20 steers there. We had almost 200 acres. And also built a polo field with mules out of a sloping area, some slope to it. So we had to move dirt, make about a 7 or 8 foot cut on the upper side and then fill the lower side to build a polo field. So playing polo, of course, that was on a horse. And with the roping steers, so I'd keep steers there and I'd let them out into the arena and just rope them. Of course, if you've seen rodeos, you know how when they're turned loose from the gate and the guys gallop along and throw a rope on them. And well, that worked fine, but after a steer had been there for 2 or 3 months, they got onto it, so they wouldn't run. They just stand there. That took all the fun out of it. So I'd have to ship those off and bring in some more. So.
So that steer had a blind spot. I wonder about your blind spot. Who holds up the mirror for you and shows you your blind spots?
That probably comes back to Betty more than anybody else. Of course, I had 3 kids. Will Jr. was born in 1911, and Mary 2 years later, and then Jimmy in 1915. So with those 3 growing up, and when they became teenagers and a little bit older than teenagers, they helped keep me straight too.
No, that's good. So in terms of keeping you straight, I mean, I think about people's morning routine. That helps me anyways to kind of keep straight, at least to know what I'm doing. I wonder what's your morning routine like?
Well, eating breakfast and reading newspapers. I would read 2 or 3 newspapers a day, typically. Of course, starting with breakfast. That was to keep up on the news. If I was in California, I'd read about what was going on in Congress in Washington, D.C., and what I observed myself and read in the newspapers that's what I used for my humor routines when I was on Ziegfeld Follies talking for 10 minutes. Every day it was different. I just talk about what was in the news. So reading and eating a good breakfast. Another thing I've said, sometimes is quoted pretty often, is a person learns it by 2 things. One is reading. The other is associating with smarter people. And I'm sure, Brian, that all the people who are watching this, either live or recorded later, they're all smarter. So we can all learn from them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with that 100%. Well, and those are really the questions I have. I do have 2 other ones that I'd like to ask you. The one is, how can I best serve you? What can I do for you? You've been so nice to come on to this show. I mean, what can I do for you?
Well, you might call one of those guys that has the late show at night, see if they get Will Rogers on their show.
Okay.
But Brian, you're already doing it. You're helping me get rid of my blind spots. Let me get on here and talk in a virtual event, which is a lot of fun, as it turns out. And I don't know, you got listeners probably all over the country, where if we were doing this live right here in Hilliard, we might do well to draw 20 people. So
yeah,
there can be advantages of these virtual events.
Well, I appreciate that. So I wonder, there's one other question I wanted to ask you, and it's who would you recommend that I reach out to that should be interviewed as well?
Oh my! How about Abraham Lincoln?
Okay.
Thomas Jefferson would be. I know those guys. You bet.
All right.
I know.
Well, we'll get it done.
Abe Lincoln lives down in Atlanta, and Thomas Jefferson lives out in Missouri. I'm sure that'd be good.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you coming on today, and it's been a good session. So I know you had something else you wanted to talk about.
Well, if it's all right with you, Brian, I'll close with something that I normally close my talks with, presentations. And here's the way it goes. Brian, a fellow asked me a while back, what constitutes a life well spent? Well, I think that love and admiration from your fellow man is all anybody can ask for. Now, I would never pretend to tell somebody else how to live their life, but the words that I live by myself is these: live your life so that when you lose it, you're ahead. Now, I don't mean to be ahead in money. Oh, that's better than being broke, isn't it? I mean to be ahead of the important things in life, things like friends, generosity, integrity. Oh, speaking of friends, I heard a professional speaker named Charlie Jarvis several years ago, and he said, one thing about friends, when you die, you want to make sure you got at least 6 of them. Well, when I die, my epitaph, or whatever those words are that you see on gravestones, is going to read, I joked about every prominent man of my time, but I never met a man I didn't like. I'm so proud of that, I can hardly wait to die. and when you come around my grave out in Claremore, Oklahoma, well, you'll probably find me sitting there proudly reading it. All right, I never met a man I didn't like. Now, Brian, if I was saying that today, I'd say I never met a person I didn't like. The key word there is met. I never met a person I didn't like. I found out if you give everybody a fair first chance to be decent, they start liking you. And when people like you, well, your whole world brightens up. And I think you'll find that if you follow that philosophy of I never met a person I didn't like, you'll find that you'll have all the love and admiration that you can handle. Now, going back, I never met a person I didn't like. Some people have criticized that, but I want to point out that that doesn't mean if you meet a person who ends up being a communist dictator or a scoundrel or a crook, that you have to like them, or even, well, people here in Ohio might include in that category, the coach of the University of Michigan. But anyway, that's the way. It means when you meet somebody, don't be prejudiced against them just because of their appearance or what you might have heard about them before. Well, I think every speaker should provide something useful. I hope we've provided some useful things here, but let me close with one that's guaranteed. And this is a plan to end all plans, and it works no matter who ends up in the White House. So here it is. Don't gamble. Take all your savings and buy some good stock and hold it till it goes up and then sell it. If it don't go up, don't buy it. Okay. Well, have a few laughs and do the best you can. Back to you, Brian.
Well, thank you so much, Will. Will, I'm so glad I met you, because you are one of a kind, and I appreciate your time today. Thank you. Thanks for coming on.
Well, this has been great. And
All right.
I don't know whether you want to mention or not. I've got a website.
Oh yeah, absolutely. How can we stay in touch with you, Will?
If people want a little bit more information, it's willrogerstoday.com is my website. And of course, the Will Rogers Museum out in Claremore, Oklahoma, that one is willrogers.com. So you can go to that one and get information also. But mine is willrogerstoday.com. And I've got a Facebook page, same thing, Facebook/Will Rogers Today.
Okay, awesome.
And I still write a weekly article. Sometimes I'll skip a week, but I try to write it every weekend and post it on my website. I'll put pieces of it on Facebook as well. So I stick with it, still trying to stay in shape and not get out of style.
Oh, that's good. Is there anything else you want to leave us with today?
Oh man, I think I've dumped enough on you already. I hope some people are hanging around here. But,
it's all been good. Thank you very much. I don't see many comments come in yet, but I'm sure they will, and we'll respond to them when they do.
All right. Thanks so much, Brian. This is fantastic.
Thanks, Will. Take care.
All right. Goodbye.